as a warfighting domain. So you can see how we've quickly transitioned from exploration and discovery to commerce and a much robust security environment. And so we all have small kids on this panel. We want space, to be used in a positive way for our children, in the future. And so in the paper, we call out that we want space to generally remain harmonious. We want it to remain accessible, organized, and regulated for our children and grandchildren's use in the future. And then those strategic goals that we lay out for the strategy, we want to promote stability, that rules-based order that I talked about. We want to deter hostile action, and then we want to continue to foster space commerce. And for all those things, we need a game plan to reach the vision and the strategic goals. And so I'd like to turn it over to Mariel, who will talk to us about policy and sustainability and her expertise. So over to you, Mariel.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. And I'm also very happy to be here on this panel, such an interesting topic. So as Chris mentioned, there's a lot of activity happening in space, right? There's, a lot of satellites that our military depends on, particularly the United States, and also our economy is really reliant on these communication satellites, on the GPS satellites, on all these other objects we have in space. And so, as Chris mentioned, there's more than 3,000 operational objects in space right now, and more than 20,000 pieces of debris that are larger than 10 centimeters. So large enough to destroy a satellite if they come into contact with it. And this is increasing rapidly. So we're having these mega constellations where one constellation has hundreds or thousands of satellites. Chris mentioned the SpaceX Starlink and some of these other communication and satellite internet systems that are a part of that. So creating a lot of objects in space, also really exciting new technologies and new developments. And I'll say I'm a part of the problem there. My satellite dish for satellite internet just arrived the other day in the mail. So we have all this activity happening that's really exciting, but we do have to think carefully about how to manage it, right? So, not only do we have that debris that's there, so the first step is kind of thinking about how we can decrease the amount of debris going forward. And that's the area from a policy context that we have probably made the most progress on internationally. So we have international guidelines on debris mitigation, things that everyone can do to be a responsible actor and try to avoid creating more debris. The next step that we're starting to really look at is issues of space traffic management. So when we have so many operational objects in space, how can we coordinate with one another internationally to make sure that we're not going to have any collisions? And you might imagine that there's some kind of system up there right now where there are rules about how you move or where you're allowed to go and what you do if there's a collision forecast. But really, it's pretty ad hoc. So for example, about a year ago, there was a large scientific satellite owned by the European Space Agency that was forecast to have a potential collision with one of these small SpaceX Starlink communication satellites. And the process was essentially for the European Space Agency to try to email and call and reach out to SpaceX. In that particular case, they actually failed to connect. There was an issue with the email or whatever way they're trying to contact them. And so the European Space Agency ended up having to expend fuel to move this large scientific satellite to avoid the potential collision without any coordination with SpaceX. And so as we get more and more objects, those kinds of engagements are going to happen more frequently. And so we really need to have a better, more systematic way of dealing with these things, right? So we're not just kind of sending emails or trying to pick up the phone and talk to someone, but actually knowing who has the responsibility to move, how should they be moving, how can we be sure that they actually did what they were supposed to do, right? How much can we rely on that? And so that whole area, the area of space traffic management, is the source of a lot of discussion right now. That said, I think we have a long way to go before those discussions become any kind of formal agreement. And as Chris mentioned, it's not just kind of coordinating these kind of commercial and peaceful activities, but there also is a concern about national security risks in space as well. So there have been rendezvous and proximity operations where satellites get very close to each other. Militaries like in the US, Russia, China have had this capability for quite some time. And we've seen Russian and Chinese satellites moving around within space and actually getting very close to other objects, including in the Russian case, close to US satellites and to commercial satellites. And right now there's no rules about that. There is no international agreement about how close is too close, for example, and what's appropriate in terms of how you interact with other people's objects in space. And so those kinds of basic agreements are things that we really need to work on and get some agreement about as well. And then lastly, when you're thinking about the debris, you can also look at the idea of active debris removal, actually going up and removing some of the stuff that's already there. And when you're looking at that area, you have technical issues, but I would also say even more thorny are kind of the economic and security issues, right? Whose responsibility is it to pay to go and remove debris from orbit, right? It's hard enough to get budget for NASA or for the DoD to build these really cool space programs that they want to create. And so to then divert some of that money to actually removing space things is a really hard sell. So how do we pay for it? Who has the responsibility right now in terms of international law? You can only remove your own objects from space. So it's not like sea where something could be abandoned and anyone could go and take it, but it's, kind of forever is owned by you. So there are legal issues about who even would be allowed to take it down. And then of course, if you have the ability to take down debris, take down old satellites, it's exactly the same technology to take down active satellites, right? And so we have this dual use issue as well. That's very difficult to figure out internationally how we want to monitor that, how we want to have those developments go forward. So that's just kind of a taste of some of these issues that are on the table on the international policy level that are really important for ensuring sustainability in space. But one of the other really important aspects of ensuring sustainability and looking at the space environment is thinking about inclusion, thinking about who's sitting at the table when we're trying to solve these problems and who's really included. And so I want to turn it over to Kat. Kat, I know this is an issue that you have worked on, inclusivity in your work with NASA and elsewhere. So I'd love to hear more from you.
Yes, thank you so much, Mariel. Chris, I really resonate with the words you were saying about making sure that everyone can be a part of space exploration and having that be sort of the backdrop of where we go with space exploration. And for me, it all comes back to this idea that as we study space, as I do planetary science, as we have these thoughts about space exploration, particularly human exploration, it really reminds me that every single aspect of STEM, every single aspect of thinking about culture and arts and humanities is really encompassed in space exploration. It is such an all-encompassing field where we can really, for example, say to young students who are just learning about science and learning about some of these topics and really, really are interested in space, that we can really teach a lot. We can teach all the different various STEM disciplines. We can teach art, we can teach culture, and we can do that in a very holistic way because just as you were saying, Chris, our love of space is an innate human, it's an innate human thing that we have. People have been wondering what's up there from every culture. That's something that just supersedes all geopolitical borders, right? So it's such an important piece that we make sure that space exploration itself remains very inclusive. So we mentioned before, thinking about the space race and the space environment in the 1950s and 60s. And that was, of course, a very political environment. So I think it's very important that as we embark upon the future of space exploration, that we keep it more inclusive and that we make it so that we are working together. And this is something that NASA has been doing for a while now. When we think about the transition with the Apollo-Soyuz program and how everything is working on the International Space Station, we're working together with countries as opposed to having space stations for each and every country up in space. So in terms of my perspective of trying to be as inclusive as possible, I also want to throw out this idea that not all countries, not all cultures, not all pieces of humanity do science in the same way. We all think of science a little bit differently. And so we need to sort of have this in the forefront of our minds as we're creating space policy, that the way things happen in the US may not be exactly the way things happen in other countries. And that's okay. The more diverse voices that we have trying to solve these incredibly difficult problems that we have, because space can be very complicated, it's very technical and we have to work together to do that. But the more voices that we can have in trying to answer those questions, the better chances we have of coming up with those answers in a faster way or in a more effective way. We can be a better workforce going into space and trying to understand space if we all do it together in an inclusive way. So one area that I always take this back to is the inclusivity of Native American populations. So one thing that's really important in my work with Native American populations and building curriculum is making sure that the cultural aspect comes first. I think sometimes we get very, very excited and very interested in the science and what science question that we can answer, but it helps if we just sort of change our lens to digging into the cultural side first. What is our culture thinking about how we study space? What is the Native American culture thinking about how we study space and how we do that? What are different countries and other cultures that are, that are beyond North America? What are they thinking in terms of how we do space exploration and how we analyze different aspects of STEM? That's really what we need to think about first, so that then we can create that policy that's going to be the most inclusive policy that we can. So that is sort of where I generally take it, is really making sure that we have all the different players involved so that we can really approach the best solutions that we have. So Chris, this reminds me of, in your paper, talking and thinking about human capital and what that really means in terms of increasing where we're going in space, but also building upon all of our different space agencies and how we're doing that in space. So what are some of your thoughts about how we can really think about human capital?
Sure, thanks, Kat. Excellent words. As we did the research for this paper, one thing we did was we took a look at the anthropology of space and how different cultures view space. And that's one area that I definitely want to continue to dig into, because I think it's an untapped field that will unlock just more abundant thinking in this category. But specifically with human capital, I did want to mention a little bit how we developed the paper, because I think from a human capital, some of those elements will come out. And so it was an intergenerational approach. And so we had two senior co-chairs for the project. One was former Secretary of the Air Force, James, and then one was former Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Cartwright. And so, they're a little bit older. They provided kind of the strategic direction. And then you had kind of a mid-level, me, that provided, my aspect. And then we had younger research assistants that were able to provide some of the research that led into the paper. And then my co-authors, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention their names, but definitely a huge thank to Clementine Starling, Mark Massa, and Julia Siegel. But again, a little bit younger cohort, and we all kind of came together and produced this paper that really has struck the right tone at the right time, I think. And I think it's for all the things that we're talking about. Space needs leadership, and for me, as a leader, I do take the human condition in mind, and the words you used, being inclusive, tapping into those areas that maybe we haven't tapped into the past, to advance space and to, unlock an environment that we can all benefit from. As a leader, I think we're all, we have a responsibility for that. And then, human capital, we call out targeting STEM, for scholarships and universities. We identify a potential STEM ROTC program. One thing we don't talk about in the paper, but I do think it should be on the table, and that is a space academy. The Air Force Academy is filling that gap right now. But, the question would be, do we need a space academy? And if so, when should a space academy stand up? So I'll throw that on the table. So including, all those different voices that you talk about is very important, and we want them to be part of outer space and where we're going. Kat, you mentioned to me previously, you're a pilot. You've seen the Earth at a higher altitude. I would be curious what your perspective is when you get up at altitude. How does that expand your mind? And if you can talk then about how that relates to space and viewing the Earth a little bit differently. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd love to know your thoughts on this as well. I am always overwhelmed when I'm flying in an aircraft, of course, if I'm flying the plane or if I'm flying commercially, of this idea of just viewing our planet as a planet. We get so easily stuck in the space that we live and the geography and the geology and everything that we see right around where we live. But we're constantly reminded, if we fly, at altitude, that we live on one planet. And so there's no, and I'm not an astronaut, but if I were to fly in space at some point, I would see that we're not seeing political borders when we're looking at the world from the International Space Station. If I'm a pilot and I'm viewing what I'm seeing on the Earth, I'm not viewing political borders at all. I'm just viewing the Earth as a planet and as a system. And so it's such a beautiful reminder about how we as humanity are a system as well. And we do have different cultures, we do have different perspectives, we do have different ways of answering problems and thinking about things. But that's always the most striking thing to me, is the Earth as a planet, and we are on it, and we are one, we are one humanity. Being on it. And so when I sort of think about that in terms of space exploration, it just keeps reminding me of how we're all in this together. And I know that that's a very complicated thing to say. It's complicated for us to think about policy that not only the US might utilize, but other countries would utilize as well. But that we are all in this together. And if we are to go to Mars, if we are to send humans to Mars, it would be very important for us to make sure that all of our different cultural perspectives are still met. And it's not just one people group or one country that's doing that as well. But Chris, I would love to know your take on this as well, because I believe you've flown higher altitude than I have.
I mean, I think anytime you can expand your mind, whether that's reading books, whether that's climbing to the top of a mountain, whether it's flying in an airplane, getting in a hot air balloon, you just get a different perspective, and it takes away the artificial boundaries that maybe you have put on yourself. And so I would agree 100% with what you said, and I completely agree.
And this is Mariel. I haven't flown, but I thought I'd add in, I love the idea that space has this global perspective, both from a scientific perspective, right? And kind of Earth science and studying Earth as an integrated system, which really NASA kind of started that whole field. But then also in the way to bring humanity together. One of my favorite stories from, reading about the history of the Apollo program, when the astronauts from Apollo 11 landed back on Earth and they did this tour around the world and went to different cities. They said everywhere they went around the world, people said, we did it, because there really was this view of humans walked on space, right? And it was this kind of thing that really globally brought people together.
Well, Mariel, with that in mind, do you have any other comments about what would be important for the general public, but also for students who are trying to learn more about this? What would be important for them to know?
Yeah, I think, it's really interesting to read about the history of space, but there is so much that's changing as we go forward. And, as you said at the very outset of the panel, we're seeing this transition to space really being used for commerce, really having a huge role in our economy and in our national security. And so I think I would say, you know, start to explore and look at all those different applications and understanding how space is playing a role in our day-to-day lives. And then, you know, that kind of transitions into understanding how to keep that space environment a sustainable place. So that's kind of where I would start.
Chris, I was really struck on your recommendation for a space academy. It would lend itself, you know, from what the US already has done with the Air Force Academy and the Naval Academy, absolutely. So I wonder if you have any vision of what education at a space academy might look like. For example, I'm always struck as being an aviation and space professor about how those two fields are really mutually inclusive of each other. You know, we can't really train pilots, for example, who are going to be commercial pilots without really understanding a lot of STEM principles, physics, flight, engineering, some of these things. So how would you envision a space academy really looking for the students?
Well, I think it's a huge opportunity. And I think the Space Academy would include all the traditional disciplines that we're used to studying at a service academy. But I think with outer space comes great responsibility. And so I think it's important to instill in the cadets not necessarily what to think, but how to think and how to responsibly use the resource, you know, for our benefit, which is very, very important. So I think ethics, you know, would be important to teach at a space academy. Sustainability, you know, principles that Marielle talked a lot about. And of course, I think the anthropology, I think culture, I think art is all important and should be included, you know, in a space academy, including emerging technology as well, right? All the hot topics that we're learning about, artificial intelligence and machine learning, and how to use those, you know, technologies, because space, there will be a space role in basically everything that we touch on Earth. So those are just a few thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really resonate with that holistic aspect of what you're saying. It's not just, it's not very narrow-minded. It's very, very holistic in that sense. I have a comment here in the chat that I'd like to read from Mehmet Ali. He says, FYI, there is a team here at AU who are working on standing up the Space Force Delta 13, which will cover not an academy per se, but is focusing on military education. So thank you so much for that additional information, Mehmet. That's really, really important to note. All right, I do want to make sure I save some time at the end for some questions. We have another question in the chat, but I thought we could end by taking just sort of a little detail here of our panelists of where do you really see space exploration in the next 5, 10, 20 years? And if you were asked to go to space, would you go? Mariel, let's start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I would definitely go. No question. That's been the the dream for years, right? So, you know, absolutely yes to that. And where do I see it going? I am really hopeful that we're going to get to Mars in the relative, you know, within a decade, 15 years, something like that. Not in the too distant future. I really feel like the international community is sort of on board. I think we'll probably do the moon first, but I think Mars is really going to happen.
Yeah, for me, I've evolved over time, but absolutely I would go to space. You know, I think it's a leadership imperative that we show a lot of leadership, responsible leadership in this area. So definitely I'd go to space. And I would agree with Mariel 100%. I think we actually need to accelerate the timeline in going, you know, human advancement to Mars. Absolutely. And I know we have a fairly aggressive timeline as it is, but if we can accelerate it by a year or two, I would definitely be in support of that. What about you, Kat?
Oh, sign me up. yesterday. I would definitely go to space for sure. It is no secret among my family and friends that I would love to be an astronaut, but I really love what I do on a day-to-day basis. So I will be honored to be a professor for the rest of my life. That sounds great as well. I have thought all my life about what it might be like to have human beings have a long-term presence on the moon, and of course get to Mars and maybe even some other places. Who knows, maybe we could figure out a way to go to an asteroid as well. I usually take a scientific perspective to this. So I know that there are some scientific complications, sustainability in terms of food, sustainability in terms of radiation is an issue. But I also know that when you stick a bunch of scientists, engineers, very dedicated individuals who have big problems to solve, that they'll get solved. So I'm really confident that we can be creative within STEM and within all the other industries that are involved in solving some of these bigger scale issues of having long-term presence in space. I'm also confident that we will be able to do it in a very respectful and an inclusive way. NASA is concerned about this, and that's just the wheelhouse that I understand from being a United States citizen, but I know that other countries are concerned about that as well. And so I'm confident that we can really do it in an inclusive and respectful way with this idea that we all love space. And this is such a great way to pull humanity together if we can do that. So.
Well, if either of you need a pilot to take you guys to space, let me know.
We definitely need a pilot, and I definitely think we need a space policy expert. And you always need a planetary scientist who can tell you what rock you're looking at. So
Absolutely.
To go. All right, I'm going to move here to the chat because I see we have a few questions. Nick asked the question, do you think countries without space programs should have a say in space policy in whole or in part?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that one. So
Thank you.
the quick answer is yes. I think definitely they should have a voice. And I think to a large extent, countries do. So if you look at groups like the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, I want to say the membership is in the 60s, 70s, something like that. It's a fairly large number of nations, including many that you wouldn't think of as traditional space actors. Now, a lot of them still do have at least a small space program, but even if you don't, as a country, being a member of something like UN COPUOS, where you're a part of that discussion, is important, right? Because you should still have a say in how space is managed, how it maintains its sustainability, so it's available for those future generations as well. Ken, I'm sure you have something to say on this topic as well.
Yeah, sure. I was going to note that, just a similarity in aviation, there's the International Civil Aviation Organization, and their membership, it's huge. It's like 100 and maybe 170, don't quote me on that, but of many different nations. And obviously each nation has a very different aviation industry in it, but the ICAO as a whole really makes sure that all of those voices are heard, not just the ones with the big aviation industries. So I could envision, something in terms of the way the ICAO does it, working in space as well. Yeah, Chris, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I would agree. I mean, the implications are, spread to every human being on this planet, whether the country has a robust space program with physical assets, in outer space. So, of course, if you have the resources, you probably have a little bit bigger voice. But I do think every country needs to participate in developing principles and how outer space should be used in a responsible way.
And I would maybe add, even if you're a country that doesn't have a space program, there's no country that doesn't use space, right? Either, a GPS kind of positioning sort of information, the communication satellites as a, backhaul for our communications, connecting remote places. So everybody somewhere in your country, there are people using space assets, whether they're aware of it or not.
Yes, great point. All right, I have another question here from Lieutenant Colonel Paul Whitmore, and he says, an undergraduate Space Force Academy would not necessarily have the student cohort size for viability. So how would you envision a separate academy operating? Chris, do you have any thoughts on that, or maybe including it in a different academy?
Yeah, I mean, I think, what we've seen from COVID is you can be super creative in how you stand up either an academic, institution. I did my fellowship all from my office that I'm in right now. So I don't, I personally like to be in person. I think that's more valuable. But I think you could create a construct where the Space Academy doesn't necessarily have to be physically in one location. You could have a cohort across the entire United States, and then occasionally maybe they do come together for some training in Huntsville or Colorado Springs or Vandenberg or on the East Coast. So I think there can be some very, very creative ways to build out a Space Academy.
Yes, and to add on to that, I could imagine, something very similar to how Air University is operating, in which you garner experts from outside who may be able to provide content or to be able to provide a course or course materials to be able to supplement that, which would just make it even better. Yeah. All right, and let's see. I have a question here that says, branching from Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore's question, would a Space Academy stem from astronaut scientific programs or military programs, or start as a new thing? It's a great question.
Yeah, I think it would start as a new thing. The old paradigm would be just to do an astronaut program, or just a military program. So I think some sort of a panel should be formed to explore what a potential Space Academy would look like for the future, not necessarily for today, but for, in 10, 20, 30 years. Because I think if you look that far out, you get some very, very creative ideas how to build out this Space Academy.
Another perspective to add to that too is thinking historically about the Apollo program. You went, and even the Mercury program. So you went through the Mercury, Gemini, and into the Apollo program with NASA choosing astronauts as test pilots. But then Apollo 17, we had astronaut Jack Schmitt, and he was the first geologist to be an astronaut and go to the moon. And so then you see this transformation of NASA then having not only pilots and commanders, of course, but also mission specialists who are scientists, engineers, doctors, and really incorporating more of that science into it. So I think we've seen that evolution, over time in terms of our astronaut corps. And so I could see that functioning in a similar way in an academy like this. Yeah, Mariel, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, so not specifically on the academy, but I think to me it's interesting, some of the questions that you go through for this echo the types of things that the Space Force as a whole is going through, right? What needs to be new and created from scratch? How can we do things differently? How can we be creative about how we approach this issue, but also, recognize the differences that space has from the air domain and how to really appreciate those and get those the level of attention that they need. So I think you see some of the same questions, on that scale coming into this question as well.
All right, I'm scanning through the chat one more time and looking for another question. Okay. Oh, I see one more. So another question that says, how much has science fiction, so books, movies, video games, influenced current and developing space policy? Any insight on this one?
So I'll say there's another professor at Georgia Tech who studies science fiction in particular. So I'm not an expert as she is, but I mean, certainly there are connections, right? Where kind of the thinking, doing this even more than 30 years, really far thinking in the future and where things are heading. I think sci-fi does provide some of that. I will say, at least speaking personally, some of the excitement and some of the ideas early in childhood and starting to think about space, certainly I was a big fan of a lot of sci-fi, and it got my imagination going, right? All the Star Trek, Star Wars, pretty much everything with space. And so I think it does play a role in connecting to society and getting people excited about the topic and thinking through the possibilities. How about the two of you?
Yeah, Chris, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree. That's what we discovered in our anthropology look in how science fiction and modern culture affects how we view and think about space. So the answer is yeah, for sure.
Yeah, short answer from me as well is absolutely. It's so fun to look back at what I call pop culture and looking at early silent films, even early literature, early things into the 1800s even, just how unique people were thinking about space exploration. Can we shoot a cannon off and send people to space? Well, no, we know the answer to that now. But these sort of thought ideas and like these little fun things that we can whimsically think about develop sometimes into an idea into the future. And then, again, you can get some very creative people working on some of these problems and seeing, hey, some of these may actually not be that far-fetched. So I think, just like the other panelists have said, I think it's really, really important to keep society really excited. And I think science fiction is a great way to do that.
So I thought of one thing I might add.
Yeah.
I think you do tend to get within the space community a lot of people who are space enthusiasts, right? And myself included, and so excited to see all of these things happen and about all the possibilities. And connecting back to some of the things we talked about earlier in our panel, I think it's also important for us, as excited as we are about new technologies and new things coming about, to think about what are the limits, right? Or what kind of responsible actions do we have to take along with it, right? And I think there is this tendency in space to kind of just want to do whatever the next thing, whatever is at the edge of possibility. But I think making sure the policy is up to date with it, right? And making sure we're doing it in a responsible way and an inclusive way is a key element.
And I'm probably in that category, Mariel. Let's push the limits.
I think we can find a nice boundary between those two things to keep our excitement and to keep us wanting to push forward, but also making sure that we're doing it in a very ethical and a very responsible way. Absolutely. And I think that's why space policy is so important. We have minds who are constantly thinking in that context, because you may have some who just want to keep going and they're so excited about the new technology and the new science, but then also making sure that that's happening. So I think that is a great place to start to wrap things up. Hold on, I have one more question. Let me see if we can answer this one real quickly. What happens if there isn't cooperation or agreement with countries about space policy? What do we do? Any quick words about that, Mariel and Chris?
Yeah, I would just real quick say it depends. It's hard to have foresight or say exactly what we should do in that case, because I think it's already happening. And so I do think we have very solid values. They continue to evolve. We continue to get better. But I think if we show strong leadership and we do take the high road, if you will, I do think we just need to move forward. People will follow us. We'll partner. We'll build those allies and relationships. And if China and Russia, don't necessarily want to come along, that's their loss. In my view.
Yeah, I would say in the long run, and maybe even in the short run, we need to get on the same page. The U.S. has the most objects of those 3,000 objects in space, but half of them, I think, at least, are U.S. related objects. And it's in our interest to make sure that we have agreements on how we're going to operate in space, right? And how we're going to avoid collisions and what counts as responsible behavior, what's appropriate, what's not. And we really need to get China and Russia on board, right? They have a lot of space objects as well, China increasing rapidly. So I think it's really worth trying to engage, and that's in our interest as the United States and also in their interest. We all want to keep space a usable environment. And if we're going to succeed at that, it has to be as a group, as a whole.
And that's where we do talk about that in the paper, where we can align, we should.
Yeah, I love what you said, Mariel, about making sure we keep space, very usable, make sure we sustain that. And that's really, the key here, that long-term sustainability. All right. Well, this has been such a very exciting and invigorating conversation. I hate to set this aside at this time, but Chris, I would love if you could sort of wrap things up for us and give us some closing remarks on space policy.
Well, thanks again for Kat, Mariel, Air University, MGM Works for giving us this opportunity. Really, really appreciate it. And so in short, just to reiterate, space is on the cusp of a transition from discovery and exploration to commerce and security that we've laid out. And to ensure that future generations are able to harness space benefits like what Kat mentioned at the beginning, to include, space tourism and exciting things like that, the U.S. needs a long-term strategy and should lead in this area. There could be 10 times the amount of physical assets in orbit in the next 20 or 30 years, and damage to those capabilities could have oversized effects on human activity on Earth. An oil spill on Earth is catastrophic. An oil spill equivalent in space could have far greater catastrophic impacts to us here on Earth. So imagine if the GPS satellites went out for whatever reason and we couldn't fly commercial airplanes safely, and how much of an impact that would have on commerce and seeing family and friends. And I mean, we saw some of that in the pandemic, and it's significant. And so we need a sustainable processes, mechanisms to maintain an accessible environment anchored in strong policy, governance, and principles. And finally, all Americans should be including and building the space domain through education, participating, and creating innovative technologies to benefit all of us. We want you to pick up a book on space, encourage your kids to learn math and science, and to critically look at our world by learning how to think, not necessarily what to think, because our children and grandchildren deserve it. So thank you, everybody, for